So with that, I think we'll kick things off. Just wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. This is part one of a two-part webinar series we're doing with our very good partner, Gimmal. So today's webinar topic is automating the management of records in your email to drive efficiency. So again, part one of two, and we very much hope that you all join us for the second part of our series, which is taking place exactly 1 month today on March 25th. The webinar this morning will be about 45 minutes, and we'll definitely leave some time at the end for questions. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. And as with all of our webinars, we really like to keep it informal and keep chat going. So if you have comments or questions or anything, please feel free to use the chat as well. And we will either get to things as we go if we can, or we'll definitely leave time at the end for Q&A. One thing to note is, of course, I will be recording the webinar and we'll send you a link to the recording tomorrow. So stay tuned for that as well. And with that, I'd like to do just a brief introduction of our presenters. We have a very talented list of presenters this morning joining us. So we have two from Colligo. We have Tim Brady, who's our CEO. Welcome, Tim. And we have Roland, who is our pre-sale engineer at Colligo. And two presenters from Gimmal. We have Jeff Tuish, who is the solution architect at Gimmal. Hey, Jeff. And Ed Kaiser, who's the senior account executive at Gimmal. Welcome, presenters. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Tim to just give a very quick introduction of Colligo.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. So for those who don't know Colligo or newer to Colligo, we've actually been around for 25 years, and we're a North American-based company. Email management is something that every organization struggles with, probably why some of you are here today, to varying degrees, and this is where we're focused. So it's really about bringing the compliance and governance to organizations while also providing and producing productivity and efficiency gains for your organization. We do this in Microsoft 365, so we're a Microsoft preferred content AI partner because of this, and so it's really about driving value from that platform. So in our view, email management is a critical part of any EDRMS project or deployment, and that's why we work with partners like Gimmal and Microsoft to help bring a complete solution to the table. We've worked with over 5,000 organizations around the world. We have a 25-year history now, and that's a little bit about Colligo. I'll pass it to Ed.
Thanks, Tim. Similarly, for those of you who don't know Gimmal, we've been doing this almost as long as Colligo. We've been in this business since 2002. We are an information governance company. Many of you may have heard of us about our records management solutions. We'll talk a little bit about that through the webinar. Our solutions cover a range of things in information governance, from helping you identify content. We'll be showing you a bit about that today, how we track it, how you govern the life cycle of content, sort of from when you find it and how long do you keep it, and then ultimately helping you make those decisions, whether you retain content or potentially ultimately dispose it. Similar to our friends at Colligo, we are a Microsoft partner. We have customers all over the globe in a variety of different industries: public sector, private sector, utilities, pharmas, etc. So our solutions are probably used in a company similar to yours right now. Go ahead and move that slide. So today we're going to talk about the ultimate goal here, which is compliance. And specifically, how do we handle email in that situation? Well, obviously, your organizations have to adhere to laws, regulations, probably different depending on your industry, or if you're a municipality, you might have freedom of information requirements that you have to meet, those sort of things. But how does email fit into that, which is a big part, and how do we address it? And if you don't address it, what happens? We're going to be protecting you from legal issues, from lawsuits, financial penalties. I have a client who failed to properly file some stuff over some environmental reports and ended up getting sued over that. So there is a lot that can happen if you don't handle your content correctly and manage it correctly. And in particular, we're going to talk about how we deal with email content today.
Well said, Ed. And I'll just point out that this is even more challenging in a continually evolving and ever-changing privacy environment, right? We're seeing this in real time in Australia right now, but here at home with CCPA and changing SEC rules and NARA, and it's just a constantly evolving environment. And so I'll double click on the word at the top here, strives, right? It's an aim and where you're trying to get to is the ideal state, but every organization seems to be at a different point on that maturity curve, and working towards that compliance is the ultimate goal there. So.
I forgot, Tim, if this was me or you, so I guess it's me. Again, as Tim just mentioned, we're going to talk about how we're managing risk, how we're avoiding penalties, damages, those reputational issues that no one wants to have happen to their organization. And similarly, we're going to talk about, if you have content all over the place, it's going to be inefficient. You're going to ask your employees to do things that might be unnatural if you have content all over the place. So having your email spread across Outlook, so many repositories, not getting it into your system of record can really open you up to a lot of risk. And the challenges that we're going to talk about today is how do we minimize that? How do we get our email into one system of record, in this case, Microsoft 365, so that you can manage it properly?
Good, yeah, and email is a key piece of this, right? As Ed touched on, I mean, 5 to 10% of emails coming into your organization are records, right? So if you're a big organization, enterprise, these numbers of emails coming in every year in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and in a lot of cases, double-digit millions, and 5 to 10% of that is records, right? Those need to be captured. That's your value to your organization, your proof, your paper trail, your business decisions. That's your tribal knowledge that needs to be captured there. Another way to kind of frame this is think of all records coming into your organization. Well, 5 of every 6 of those come in via email, from what our analysis and our data tells us. And so email is a critical channel that needs to be managed. It's the primary way that records are communicated and ingested into the organization, right? So think of any legal document, accounting document, finance document that you've dealt with recently, whether it's purchase orders, invoices, contracts, right? They all are transmitted via email. And so this is just an absolutely critical part to make sure you're capturing those important ones. Now, the key here is not all need to be saved, right? The inverse of this is that 90 or 95% of them aren't needed to be saved and protected and kept and aren't of value, right? Those should probably be purged and deleted. And every organization kind of has differing policies on this part. But it's really that 5 to 10% that is critical that you want to make sure you're capturing. And leaving these unmanaged in Outlook mailboxes just creates thousands of silos across the organization, right? Think of those as each mini repositories or silos that are personal to each individual, and that's just simply, not compliant. So, big focus here on the email piece, and it's just a critical part of any records management system.
So, as Tim just mentioned, you shouldn't use Outlook mailboxes as a repository. I know that many of us are guilty of that, probably me included to a certain extent, but there's a lot of reasons you don't want to do that. There's a huge volume of content in Outlook and Exchange, and even if your organization is, as is kind of typical these days, purging content after 2 or 3 years, that still leaves you with a massive volume of content to try to manage and search in Outlook and Exchange. Overwhelming amount of content. The other thing from a compliance standpoint that's really critical, it is very, very difficult to make content immutable in Outlook. That means users pretty much can always delete it. And for those of you who are records managers, you know right away that breaks compliance. So the best practice that we're suggesting is to move those emails that are potentially records into a system of record. And in this case, most of our clients are moving to SharePoint Online, so part of Microsoft 365. So once the content is there, now you're in a managed repository where you can securely store things. You can manage them. You can retrieve them. You can delete them if they are going to be you can manage the deletion of those records. If you're using some of them out of the box functionality of Microsoft 365 for sort of basic records management, if you can put retention labels on that content, or as we're going to talk about in part 2 of this webinar, if you have some more advanced records management requirements, if you want to manage cases, more hierarchical file plans, and so on, we'll talk about that, but we could certainly do that once the content is already in SharePoint Online. And then, of course, as Tim mentioned, it's not just the emails, it's the attachments. They're hugely important. That's where your safety reports are coming in, your purchase orders, your invoices, contracts, lease documents, loan documents, etc. So we want to get all that content into Microsoft 365. We can apply records policy there, but also from a collaboration standpoint, now that content is in your collaboration space and it's not siloed in an individual mailbox or inbox that is unique to one individual. So that all sounds really good, and you can tell your user base, please, folks, move your content into SharePoint Online. That's what we'd really like you to do. Great idea. The chance of everyone in your enterprise or even a few people in your enterprise doing that are probably pretty slim. The problem is people just don't do it. It's not part of their day job. It's burdensome. It's laborious. And by the way, you don't get all the metadata if you do it that way. So that really brings up a need for some automation. And that's what we're going to talk about here next.
Excellent. And just before I turn to the next slide, love to hear in the chat, keep it collaborative. If anyone's struggling with this this challenge that Ed mentioned here, I assume it's many, right? That having your workers and your team members actually do it and file their emails is just a big and broad challenge. But love to hear from anyone. Great. And so to Ed's point, what's the solution here, right? So this is a massive problem. It all sounds great on paper, but limited uptake. And this really highlights the need for automation, right? In our view, the automation, augmenting the human efforts is the key way to solve this, right? The automation becomes critical because, again, if you're in an organization with thousands or hundreds of people, right, the email volumes just stack up, and it's really hard to make sure everybody's on board manually doing this. You really need to rely on automation to help augment the human effort to do this. So what we advocate for is fewer choices, make it simple. Always, if you're earlier on and building these processes up, like make the options limited to start so that it's easy and manageable to start tackling. Having some retention policy in place is better than none at all, right? And then you can make it more sophisticated as you go on, but make the options simple for people as they go and save these emails to SharePoint and these records and highlight them. And I just want to highlight the importance of it being automated and automation rather than AI or anything in that vein, because automation is rules based, right? So it means that we're more accurate, it gets the job done. You often get a confirmation that it's been done appropriately and properly. And this is a lot more trustworthy because when you're dealing with records, you can't have errors, right? You need these to end up in the right spot and be kept for the right amount of time. Otherwise, you can face the penalties that Ed was speaking to earlier on. And this is where automation is key to make sure that happens. Again, having the human oversight is a critical part of that so that it can take actions and course correct as different rules and whatnot need to be changed and altered and updated. So what we're saying is taking the user out of the complexities here, make it simple, and then leverage the automation to make sure it gets done all the time, right? And so I think many here would agree that the ideal state is identify a record, tag it, file it, and put it all in the right spot and do all of this end-to-end automatically. Well, with our two solutions, as we'll get into on the next slide, Gimmal and Colligo can make this super simple and make this come to life and get pretty darn close to that. Well, providing the automation you need, but the necessary oversight at the same time to ensure that completion accuracy and reporting that you rely on. And I'll just share an anecdotal story from one of our clients that came to us and we were able to help them out. But, prior to working with us, they came to us and said, every year Christmas break became filing for the admin team, right? They'd go and file all the emails that the team had built up over the year, right? I think they were in the legal department, so legal and compliance emails that had built up over the year that should have been filed, and it was a 2-week exercise, right? And our view is that's not how anyone should be spending their holiday break, their that time of year. And we could cut this down massively to less than a day if they were using the automation. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that as we hop to the next slide there.
Thanks, Tim. And what we're going to dive into a bit more of the detail here in a moment, but we're going to leverage Gimmal's Discover solution to look across a variety of different across any number of email inboxes and mailboxes, and look for content that might be a record. This smells like a contract. Looks like an invoice. Anything that could potentially be a record, such that we want to move that and put record policy downstream. So what Gimmal Discover will do is look across your users' mailboxes, identify content that could potentially be a record, and then move it to a place where Colligo's email manager can move it into SharePoint from there. And then at the end, once the content is in SharePoint online, downstream, and which will be part 2 of this webinar series, we'll talk about how Gimmal Records can put records policy on that content, whether it be an email or an attachment to that email or any other content for that matter, and run it through its life cycle on through either ultimately saving it, making it immutable, or potentially taking it all the way through disposition. So we're going to focus on the first 2 concentric circles here in this webinar, and we'll talk about Gimmal Records in webinar part 2. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you here right now, and if you can run the folks through a little bit how Discover can identify content in mailboxes.
I can do that. Thanks, Ed. Okay, everybody. So we've heard about what we need to do. Now we need to figure out how can we do it. So one of the things that Gimmal Discover can do with email, it can look at both the metadata, such as subject, to send to, what have you, all the various components of that, as well as the content. So we're talking the body of the message, as well as the attachments. So Gimmal Discover can look at both of these to help you make decisions on what data you want to interrogate, how you want to interrogate it, such as, is a particular word in the subject line, or do I find a word inside the content? You can do all of that with Gimmal Discover, and then you can identify that saying, okay, this message, I want to have this be a record. So that's how you do it. So I'm showing you some examples of some metadata and some values. So I'm not going to read these off to you. You can read this for yourself because we're going to jump in a little bit in the next slide. We're not ready yet, but we're going to jump in and look at some of the ways we can interrogate a message. But keep in mind, you can do this at the mailbox level. So if you say, you know what, anything that is in this person's mailbox, I'm going to consider the record. Maybe they're in legal or HR. You can go down to the folder level. So I'm talking inbox, sent items, deleted items even. You can go into the personal folders that users are creating of their own. So this is not limited to only things they are in inbox and sent. Anywhere in the mailbox, we can go look for that metadata and content. We can go down to the message level, which is the most common thing, which I'll be diving into deeply here in the next couple of slides. So anything about the message that you want to look at. Also the attachments on it. So you'll see some of the examples. So could we possibly go through and say, I want to make sure it's from this mailbox and in this folder with this subject line holding this attachment? The answer is yes. So you can make up very complex conditionals, ands and ors, basically, if you want to look at it that way, to be able to fully qualify a message saying, this is something I need to do. So what this means is at the admin level, at your administrative level for your mailboxes, you have the ability to make up these decisions and then have records be created from them. So this is not something the users would do. This is something you can do company-wide. And once again, base it upon certain mailboxes. Maybe there's certain mailboxes that you want to exclude. You could certainly do that as well. So it doesn't have to be for everybody, but what allows you to do is give you that granularity to be able to make those decisions at any level that we have. And if we talk about metadata, you're going to see some of the operators, and you're going to notice a lot of these things are antonyms, opposites. So looking at the age of a message, older or newer than, whether the age is equal or not equal to a particular value. Looking at the date time, we can also do that way. We can qualify messages. Looking at numerical values, maybe the size of the message gives you insight. Anything like that, you have those operators. And then we get into the textual fields, things like subject and sender. So if you want to pick out a particular domain, for instance, any email that was sent from a particular domain, that's going to be considered a record. Discover can do that. So you'll see the things you can do here: equals and not equals, contain does not contain. I want to draw your attention to the last line, and that is like, is not like, and regex. So first, let's talk about is and is not like. That means patterns. So one of my examples I like to use is use a verb and all the different tenses of that verb. So if you put an asterisk after the prefix of that verb, we can find all the tenses of that. You don't have to list all the ings and eds and all the past and present tenses you have to. You can just use the wildcards. And then if you've ever ventured into the dark world of regex, which I have skimmed the surface on, then what you can do with that is find patterns. For those of you who don't know what regex is, it is actually an abbreviation for regular expressions. And for instance, if you wanted to find sensitive data, credit cards, social security numbers, passport numbers, Medicare ID, VIN numbers, whatever it might be, something that is pattern-based, that's where regex comes into play. It gives you a lot of power to be able to identify. So you might be saying, okay, well, how do I know that I want to go ahead and do this, but I want to make sure that I am doing it properly? Well, one of the things you can do is actually perform an analysis in Discover, get a report out of it, and say, okay, yeah, you know what I'm doing looks really good. I'm going to go ahead and now pull the trigger and actually perform the work. So you have a chance to simulate the work prior to actually doing it. So you can perfect your criteria, because most likely, let's be honest, first time it's probably not going to be exactly what you want. You might be finding some false positives. You might be finding some false negatives, whichever. So it just gives you a chance to do that. So keep in mind, you don't have to just say, well, I'm running right from the start. You can walk a little bit first and analyze. Okay, that was a lot on that first slide. So we're going to jump to the next slide here, please. So I talked about the metadata for a message. So what I'm showing you on the left-hand side, we call these tokens. And these tokens all represent different value. The second column, you'll notice what kind of token it is as far as what kind of field, textual, numeric, what have you. And then to the right, it gives you a really good description of what you could be looking at. So for instance, if we wanted to look at the CC list, I wanted to look at all the addresses that are carbon copied on an email. I could use that maybe to harvest the messages that I want to process. Or maybe I'm interested in the creation date. So you can do that as well. You'll see the email date. So that's where you can say equal to or before a certain date or after a certain date. You can do that. You have the end date. If you have meetings, you want to look at the end date of a meeting to be able to get the attachments out of that. You can do that as well. Notice the fourth from the bottom has attachments. Does this email have an attachment? Because if it doesn't, maybe I don't want to consider that a record. I only want messages that have attachments on them. So you can use that to determine that. Email importance, same kind of thing. Was something set at high importance? Maybe that has something of record value that I need to keep. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And we have even more tokens that we can use. So keep in mind, once again, we can stack these. These can be or conditions or and conditions. I could check one thing and say, well, it doesn't match that, but maybe I have something else I want to check. So there are literally millions of permutations of things you can do with this because of all the different combinations that exist. Here we have the receive date, which is a very good date to use on a message to properly age it, because every sent and received email has the receive date on it. We have the sender address. Once again, maybe you're using the domain name or a particular sender. You do that as well. And you'll see the subject line there as well. So that's another thing that you can leverage to be able to qualify the message. So this is all the metadata I'm talking about. Now there's metadata at the folder and the mailbox level as well, but most people go after the email and or the attachment to determine. So on the next slide, please, what we're going to see is what can we do with content? Because this is the big thing. This is the thing most people want, because a subject line might not be telling enough for us to say, yeah, that's a record. We need to actually crack open that email, look inside of it, and see what's there. So if you wanted to use particular keywords, you could do that. You could just list a list of keywords that match it, such as addendum or what have you, to determine something is a contract. Or we can do a phrase, and a phrase is basically a value that has the space within it that's part of the text you're looking for, like I have here in the example with John Smith, which is enclosed in double quotes. There's that wildcard I talked about. So looking for the word transfer, which would be transferred, transferring, all those are going to match. That is an asterisk at the back of that. So that acts as a wild card. Then you have all the fun things you can do with Boolean expressions, ands and ors and nots. Excludes proximity, which means something near. I want to find a word within 5 words of another. Use parentheses like you would do for order of operations for mathematical equations. You can combine all these together to get very, very complex regular expressions and Boolean expressions to be able to perform the work you want to do. So down below, you're going to see some examples. I want to find John Smith and agreement or signature. Look what I've done with the parentheses. I said both John Smith and agreement have to be true, or it just has to have the word signature. Or I'd use a wildcard with transfer an account, or there's regex. If you've ever been dying to see regex, this might be your first chance to see that. This is looking for a social security number. It's basically saying 3 digits followed by a hyphen, followed by 2 digits, followed by a hyphen, followed by 4 digits. So you can use all these different things. Question, can you do metadata and content together? Absolutely. So once again, you have a lot of power in here to fully qualify, to mitigate your false positives, and to make sure you include all your true positives. So what is the process for all this? So you would set up Gimmal Discover. It would go through, it would interrogate the metadata and or content using the criteria that you established. We're going to make a copy of the message. We don't want to take the message out of the person's mailbox because maybe they haven't read it yet, quite honestly. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a copy of it, put it into the folder that Colligo is monitoring, and then Colligo is going to take that message and create an MSG file from it and or use the attachments within SharePoint as well. So that's the process. Discover goes through, fully qualifies the message based upon all this criteria we talked about, and then we hand it off to Colligo by putting in a particular folder. That's the transfer point. That's where the intelligence and the synergy between the two products comes in, is that we put it into the same folder that they're monitoring. So hopefully that gives you some nice insight as to how Gimmal Discover can find the messages that you think should be records.
And now we're going to pass it to Roland for a demo on the Colligo side.
All right, great. So thanks, Jeff. So I guess metaphorically and literally, we're handing off from your product from Gimmal over to Colligo, and I'm going to show you how Colligo manages the next step in the pipeline process. And this is how to get those emails from the folder that was discovered by Gimmal Discover and put into a particular folder. So in this case here in my mailbox, I'm using the new Outlook, but it works with the Classic as well, or just Outlook Online. So Gimmal's going to run, and it's going to find, let's say we're going to find all the contracts, and we're going to put that into a folder here. I just created this folder called Colligo Email Records. So this is all populated by Gimmal Discover. And so then the next step is for Colligo to copy all this over to SharePoint. Now, one thing we want to do is copy it over in a way that's useful. And here's something that's not useful. So this is how a lot of people do their emails, where they just create a library. I'll just call it the vanilla library. And you can drag and drop emails into your SharePoint or copy them over in various ways. But in the end, it doesn't really work out too good. Like on the surface, it appears pretty good. Like you've got the subject here, subject of the email .msg, but you don't really have the metadata. Just think about how would you find that email again. Think of how you're finding an email in Outlook. You're looking not only at the subject, but who sent it to you, when did you receive it, and other factors. And of course, if there's multiple people using this library here, how do you prevent duplicates? So there's nothing inherent in this method to prevent duplicates of people putting many emails in here. So what you want is a kind of a more robust kind of system. And so here's a library that's been set up specifically for email. I actually have an email view here. And we have the subject of the email will show up in the title. So that's obviously a clear metadata that people will want to use. The name column here, that's the file name, but we find that it's not really used that significantly for emails that are put into SharePoint. It's important because you do need a file name, but you can just kind of collapse it down and just look at the subject, look at, who is the email to, who is it from, when did you receive it, and you can have this column sorted, of course, just like it is in Outlook in, chronological order. And that allows you to then also use the filters in SharePoint. So you can kind of filter based on, who sent it to you, date range, and so on. So, for example, I want to say all the emails from Mr. Microsoft 365 here. All right, because this column is filtered. And then I can also filter on date range and so on. So you do want to put things into SharePoint in a way that gives you metadata, and that therefore makes it easy for you to use this. So if this was a contract library, it would make it really simple for me to go and find things, and not only with the filters here, but of course, the search as well, which will search every word and every phrase within that email. Okay, so how do you do this? How do we get content from Outlook into here? Especially, how do we get those discovered emails over? And so that's where Colligo Email Manager is quite useful. All right, so I'll just select an email here. So Colligo Email Manager, it's been around for, at least 15 years. I think 15 years of our 20 years life, we had an email manager. And of course, it's very useful for reading an email saying, oh, this needs to go into a certain location. You select a location, it gets copied over, and we'll extract all the metadata and so on. So that's what we'll call the interactive way. But what's really helpful is we have automatic filing, and this works really well with the Discover product. So the Discover is putting all the emails into this location here. And so you just go into Colligo at the beginning. You say, well, this is the folder that I'd like you to process. And then you select a destination where you would like it to go in SharePoint. And that's it. Well, there's one more step. You have to set a schedule. And that's it. You can then leave Colligo closed. And you could just let Colligo automatically look at your emails here on a schedule, let's say daily, and copy things over. And because Colligo runs as a web add-in, it's going to work in the cloud. It doesn't require your computer to be on, doesn't require Outlook to be running. It's just going to work automatically regardless. And the other nice thing about this is that if you're reading an email and you say, well, this actually is a record, and maybe we don't have a rule set up in Discover to find it. You say, well, I know this is a record. I can just drag and drop that into my record folder, and then it will be incrementally uploaded to SharePoint as well. Okay, so I think that less is more for this kind of demo. I just wanted to show you how simple it is. And so then I'll pass things over to Tim.
Great, yeah, and so just to round it off and bring it all together, right? So first we found the emails and attachments. We use a Discover, right? And then we move them into a folder in Outlook, and then from there with Colligo, and once the automation's set up, we pipe them over to SharePoint automatically and grab all the metadata and things you need from a record keeping perspective and a search perspective. And it's all about making this incredibly simple end to end, right? And this is what some of our clients are calling a game changer, is this end to end story and this end to end solution here. The missing piece here is really, how do you manage these emails and attachments as records and manage their life cycle and whatnot on the SharePoint side, which is where Gimmal Records comes into play. And we'll really dive into that at our next webinar, which is part 2. And as Sarah mentioned, that's on March 25th. And so we're really focused on the left half, or the left 2/3 of this Venn diagram today, and we will cover the second half, or the right side, in webinar part 2. And with that, we will go to questions.
Great. Thank you all. And just to everyone who's with us, feel free to, got some time here, so I'm happy to answer questions. So feel free to type your questions into the chat or the Q&A. I've got a couple to get us started here. Looks like this one is a bit of a 2-part question, maybe for Jeff. Jeff, what is the name of the folder that Colligo's monitoring? And then similarly, can Gimmal Discover create the monitoring folder in every mailbox?
Good question. So the name of the folder is actually your choice. So you get to choose what that is. We don't force that upon you. And as far as can Discover create that folder in every mailbox? Yes. And that's crucial, quite honestly, because that way somebody doesn't fat finger the folder name and wondering why their records aren't being put into SharePoint because they misspelled the folder name. So we can definitely go through that, and that can be a perpetual process. So you can actually set up a schedule to have that folder creation done maybe once a week. So as you add new mailboxes to your environment, then we'll be sure those new people also have that folder present.
And Jeff, just a question from me. It could be multiple folders too, right? It's not just necessarily one folder.
Correct. Yeah. So if you wanted to have a folder structure, maybe a parent folder called Colligo, for instance, lack my imagination, and then you could have folders underneath it called accounting or HR, or whatever you wanted to call them. Yes, and we could harvest, well, just like you said, from the multiple folders as well.
Great. And then a related question just came in, and I'll maybe get Jeff and Roland to take this one. So Linda's wondering, does each person set the rules for the folders that will automatically be uploaded to SharePoint, or does the IT team do that?
Okay, so from the Colligo side, you set the rule. Each individual will set up the rule that would copy it from their Outlook over to SharePoint. That's something that's in flux. That could be automated in the future. It really just comes down to customer requests and what's going to be best for our overall customer community. But I think that's where we're going to be going eventually.
And from a Discover standpoint, to find those emails, that would most likely be IT or legal is the ones that's dictating that. Maybe the records manager is looking for particular things. So that would be a more global thing as opposed to a user-based decision. Not every user is going to say, for my mailbox, we're going to use these keywords. And for this mailbox, we're going to use other keywords. That's not how it typically is done. It's going to be admin-based at the company level.
Yeah, and the policies would typically, in practice, be pushed down from your records management or EIM program saying, hey, folks, just so you know, we are going, and we have found absolutely that from a change management perspective, communication to your end users is really critical. Let them know that this is happening, but they should know that, we will be going, we have policies, we will be looking at inboxes, and if we see things that look like contracts or potential records, we will be moving them into SharePoint where we can manage them. And I think both Jeff and Tim, there's a subtle thing here. I think there's some options so users don't freak out to either copy or move things. Is that correct?
Sure.
Yeah.
Correct.
Things won't necessarily disappear from their inbox. They can still find them, or if they're looking for the attachments, even though they can still find them from their inbox, although they might actually now physically be sitting in SharePoint Online.
Correct.
But ultimately, as part of a big project, these kind of policies are pushed down from your records management or probably or from your legal teams.
And I'll just add on the practical side, what we see take place is often teams will have an admin that can go and set this up on behalf of, say the legal team or on behalf of senior leaders. So it makes that burden of setting up the automation on the Colligo side easier when there's like a designated person who can do that, right? So it can be there can be someone setting it up on behalf of other users.
Yeah, just to add to what Tim said, all that's required for that to work is you delegate the mailbox. So that's just a simple setting where, maybe you have let's say a lawyer and there's a paralegal that's delegated to manage that mailbox on their behalf.
Great. Thanks all. And then Jackie is wondering, can you move contents of Outlook email files as a whole? Roland, maybe that's over to you, or Ed. Yeah.
I think Roland, I think you have the option, correct me if I'm wrong, you would be the expert, and you can move the email and the attachments, or you can move them as one. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you have an option. So it's part of the configuration for the move tool, whether you move or copy first of all, and then also whether you split that attachment out. So, and we also have ability to, when you're splitting out the attachment, to make sure that attachment doesn't override other attachments. So if you receive a lot of invoice.pdfs or budget.xls, we will ensure that you don't override other files that are similarly named but just have a different content. So that's all handled in our product.
Great. And then similarly, Roland, Linda's wondering, would we set the retention for the folder or each email?
I'm going to take that one, Sarah. That's
okay. Yeah, great.
Stay tuned for part 2, because the answer is typically there's a lot of things that you might set the retention on once you move that content into SharePoint Online, depending on who it's from, what it contains, and it might fall into a different record series. So part of the automation of Gimmal Records would be to scan that content once it's in SharePoint Online and assign it to an appropriate record series, and or potentially more than one record series, depending on the content. So that's something that you would do on the SharePoint Online side when you set up Gimmal Records, and then it will classify content, whether it's based on certain criteria you set up, whether it's an email, an attachment, like the type of content is sort of immaterial at that point. It will assign it to an appropriate record series.
Great. So the answer to that is then stay tuned for part 2. Come
Right,
back in 1
the
month,
answer is
right?
the records manager would set up general retention rules, not necessarily specific to each email.
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in still, so we'll get to a few more here. Is purview a requirement for Gimmal or Colligo?
No.
No.
Easy. Anyone want to elaborate or?
Well, I no, and I think fundamentally, from a records perspective, if you're using some of the purview, you don't need. This works with E3/G3 licenses. You do not need the higher level Microsoft licenses. These tools work independent of what you may or may not be using with purview. If you are using some parts of purview, sometimes we can leverage that, sometimes not, but there's not a requirement to use purview. And I should also mention, I think as most people know, there's a lot of features within Purview, not just around records management, that your organization might want to use for other purposes.
Excellent. A couple more here. Some great questions coming in. Wish we had more time. Lisa's wondering, do you recommend setting up folders by user or department? How do you handle access to multiple people versus limiting access, for example, HR documents?
Sounds like a SharePoint question.
Well, certainly, once you move the content into SharePoint, the privileges on the content don't go away. So we would be, I think that's handled by Active Directory, but I'm a little bit out of my depth there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in general, you have to consider the access, like what's the access required on the SharePoint side. I mean, ideally you have, teams are going to collaborate over, content that's for that team, and you don't want to have obviously personnel matters showing up, in a sort of a shared site that should go to an HR site. So I think the rules in Discover would be tuned to put the appropriate content in the appropriate folder in Outlook, and then those get funneled into the right secured location over in SharePoint. And that's where the ACL or the access control list takes over and ensures compliance, security, and so on.
Great. And here's a great question from Alex. We would want to save all emails, including deleted emails. And he or she is asking, doable, sensible? Who wants to weigh in on that one?
I would suggest, go ahead. I've got a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, if you just want to archive emails, there's some out of the box stuff from Microsoft that you can just archive all the emails. I don't know that you would want to put all of your emails into SharePoint. Maybe I would be. I haven't had a client do that. I don't know if Tim, if you have.
Yeah, I think there's really two different classifications here of saving emails. There's the save everything model. That's more for just the just in case model, where maybe there's regulations to say you have to keep everything that you send and receive, but those typically are not used for any kind of collaboration or any kind of knowledge management. They're just kept in a cloud or some server in a back room, which just basically journals everything that happened, but nobody wants to go look at it. In fact, nobody can look at it except for if there's some sort of legal case, then somebody has to figure out, how do I discover that information again? So that's a completely different animal. And that's purpose built for just save everything, but expect never to look at it unless sued or you are suing. On the other hand, what we're suggesting is the records management. It's where it's going to add value to your company to be able to put it in a place that people can see it when they require it. So I can go look at that contract. I can, the next project iterations come up and I need to go look at what did we do on the last version of the website or the last version of the HR system. So we want to everything that we're suggesting is for collaboration. I mean, it's for compliance as well, but it's sort of in that realm of compliance/collaboration where the save everything model, that's more of a utility. That's just a, you know, and that can actually work alongside. You can actually have both, and we do suggest both if you have that requirement to save everything.
Yeah, I think Roland and we have one joint client. I believe that archives everything that's 6 months old, deletes everything that's 3 years old after 3 years old. But they're also moving their key emails into SharePoint Online for collaboration and records purposes. So
Yeah.
a combination of both.
And just to round that off, so is it doable? Yes, we have a client that uses us to save all emails in the organization, and it's not a cost-effective way to do that, but it certainly can be done. Sensible, I would say, not our recommended best practice, right? Again, we hope that clients are focused on using Colligo for the 5 to 10% of emails that are records and are important to keep in a central location. We have to round that off. So.
Great. Well, we're at time now. So I just want to thank all of our panelists today, very informative, and our audience members for coming. We had quite a few questions actually we didn't get to, which are interesting. So never fear, we will reach out to you separately to get your questions answered. And of course, you can also reach out to us anytime. Christina's just kindly put our contact information in the chat there, our 2 email addresses. So if you have specific questions for anyone, feel free to reach out anytime. And of course, I'm going to invite you to come back for our compelling part 2 of this webinar series. As Tim mentioned, today we showed you Gimmal Discover and Colligo Email Manager, and next month we'll be showing Colligo Email Manager along with Gimmal Records. So you won't want to miss that, and we look forward to seeing you again in 1 month's time. Thank you so much again to everyone for joining us today.